What if the most important line in this week's news isn't in the headline at all, but buried 4 paragraphs down where almost nobody scrolls? Because inside the exact same reporting being used to announce that Iran has finally been crushed, there's one quiet sentence that points in the complete opposite direction. Before we open that up, do me a small favor. If you're the kind of person who wants the real picture instead of the loud one, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and send this to one friend who always argues with you about the Middle East. That's it. That single click tells the algorithm to keep pushing careful breakdowns instead of screaming thumbnails. Now let's get into it. Here's the line that changes everything. According to the reporting that surfaced alongside the news of the pause in fighting, the slowdown in strikes came after reports that reduced American stockpiles of key munitions were factoring into military decision-making. Read that again slowly. Not Iran collapsing, not Iran begging, not Iran signing anything. American ammunition supply being cited as one of the reasons the shooting paused when it did. That's a very different story than the one you were promised. And the gap between those two stories tells you more about where this war actually sits than any dramatic claim ever could. So let's slow down and do this properly. Let's walk through what is actually confirmed, what is being asserted, and what is being invented on top of both. By the end of this, you'll be able to read every future headline about this conflict and instantly know whether it's describing reality or selling you a feeling. Start with the shape of the war itself, because you can't judge a single week without knowing the road that led to it. This conflict didn't begin last month. It began at the end of February, when Israel and the United States launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran. The opening blow was enormous. According to the timeline being tracked by multiple outlets, the very first strike killed Iran's supreme leader. The stated goals were sweeping: dismantle Iran's nuclear program, break its ballistic missile infrastructure, and pressure the system itself until it changed. Iran did not fold. It hit back across the region. American bases were struck, Israel was hit directly, sites in neighboring states were attacked, and then Iran did the one thing that terrifies every economy on Earth. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. That's the artery. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that narrow stretch of water. When it shuts, the price of everything shifts. Shipping insurance spikes, flights get canceled, supply chains bend. This stopped being a regional fight almost immediately and became a global economic event. The fighting ran for more than 5 weeks. Then, in early April, a ceasefire was agreed between the United States and Iran, with Israel included in the arrangement. And here's where the pattern begins. That ceasefire held, but only in the way a cracked dam holds. Both sides violated it. The tracking on this is blunt about that. Even after it was extended indefinitely later in April, the violations continued. Then came May. In the middle of what was technically still a ceasefire period, American forces conducted airstrikes on Iran, hitting military sites in the south and in Tehran itself. Why? Because Iran had been targeting American warships during the naval blockade that was already in place. Sit with that for a second. A formal ceasefire existed on paper. Iran was still going after American naval vessels. America was still striking Iranian soil. Both sides were technically at peace and actively shooting at each other at the same time. That is not a story about one side steadily grinding the other into dust. That's a story about two sides trading blows and calling it a truce. In June, mediators announced a memorandum of understanding meant to formally end the war within 60 days. For a moment, it looked like the real thing. Then, July arrived, and Iran struck 3 commercial vessels that had gone outside the shipping corridor Tehran had pre-approved through the strait. That was the trigger. The agreement collapsed. Trump publicly soured on it during a NATO summit, criticized Iran's leadership over tanker traffic, and effectively declared the deal dead. Fresh strikes followed within the same week, aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping. So by the time we reach the current pause, count what has already failed. The April ceasefire, the extension of that ceasefire, the Islamabad talks, the June memorandum, 4 separate attempts at de-escalation in roughly 5 months. Every single one broke. Now, with that history in your head, look at this week again. The reporting says the United States and Iran paused their attacks after days of renewed escalation. The pause is real. That part is confirmed. And it was described as an effort to give peace talks room to breathe. But here is the detail that should stop you cold. Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson stated publicly that Iran currently has no negotiations with the United States. None. He said the only official talks Iran is engaged in are with Oman, and those talks are narrowly about the future of the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran also explicitly denied media reports, claiming it had agreed to any 10-day ceasefire. Think about what that combination actually means. The guns went quiet. But Iran is on the record saying it never signed anything, isn't talking to Washington directly, and is only willing to discuss one specific issue through one specific middleman on its own terms. That is not surrender. That is positioning. A genuinely defeated government does not get to deny that a ceasefire exists. A genuinely defeated government does not get to choose the mediator. A genuinely defeated government does not get to pick out which single topic it's willing to discuss and refuse everything else. Defeat looks like accepting someone else's terms. What Iran is doing is setting its own. And that brings us back to the munitions line, because I don't think most people understood how heavy that sentence really is. Modern air campaigns are not infinite. They run on precision-guided weapons, and those weapons are expensive, complex, and slow to build. Every strike consumes something that took months to manufacture. A sustained, high-tempo bombing campaign burns through inventory at a rate that can outrun even the largest defense industrial base on the planet. So when reporting says that diminished stockpiles are factoring into military decision-making, that isn't a footnote. That's a window into the machine. It suggests the pause wasn't purely a choice made from overwhelming strength. It suggests at least part of the timing was practical. Not we've won, so we'll stop. More like we need to manage what we have left. That's an inconvenient detail for a total victory story, which is probably exactly why it got so little attention, while the dramatic framing traveled everywhere. Now, let's check the reaction of the people who have actual money on the line, because markets are brutally honest in a way headlines are not. When the pause was reported, oil prices dropped sharply. Stocks jumped at the open. Relief was immediate and visible, but then the gains faded. Some of that rally was given back before the trading day even ended. That pattern matters. A sharp relief spike followed by a partial retreat tells you investors treated this as real, meaningful news, but not as the end of anything. If markets genuinely believed Iran's government had been broken and the conflict was finished, you would not see traders quietly pulling chips back off the table hours later. Money hedges when the future is unclear. Money doesn't hedge against a war that's over. So we have a pause that is real, an Iranian denial that is real, American supply constraints that are real, and a market reaction that is real but cautious. None of those four things point toward total defeat. Every one of them points toward something messier and far more human. Two exhausted sides catching their breath. If you're following this so far, here's a small challenge for you. Pause for 2 seconds and hit, like right now, not because I asked, but because you want more videos that slow the story down instead of shouting it. And if you've got a strong opinion forming already, drop it in the comments. I read them, and the sharpest ones usually end up shaping the next breakdown. Subscribing costs you nothing and keeps you ahead of the noise. Now let's turn to the part of this story that genuinely is dark, because there's a real crisis inside Iran right now, and it deserves honesty rather than convenient spin. According to reporting from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the Iranian government has carried out at least 48 political executions since the war began at the end of February. In one single week in mid-July, 5 political prisoners were executed. That's close to 1 execution per day during that stretch. That same reporting describes the pace as unprecedented, even measured against Iran's own grim history, and it connects the crackdown to something specific, a massive nationwide uprising in January of this year. The claim is that the government is using the fog of war as cover, arresting and executing at scale while the world's cameras are pointed at missiles instead of prison courtyards. Now, I want to be straight with you about the source, because that matters. The NCRI is an Iranian opposition organization. It is affiliated with the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. Its explicit goal is the removal of Iran's current government. That doesn't automatically make its reporting false, and it often includes very specific details, names, dates, court branches, the kind of specificity that is hard to fabricate at scale. But it is not a neutral observer. It has a direct interest in portraying the Iranian state as brutal and illegitimate. So hold it the way you should hold any interested source. Take the pattern seriously. Verify the individual claims where you can. Don't treat it as a scoreboard. And the pattern it describes is, unfortunately, extremely believable. Authoritarian governments under external attack almost always tighten their grip at home. War gives them a justification. War gives them emergency powers. War gives them a distracted world. It's one of the oldest moves in the book. But here's where I need you to think very carefully, because this is exactly where the total defeat narrative smuggles itself in. Domestic repression and military collapse are not the same story. In fact, they often contradict each other. Executing political prisoners at scale is not something a collapsing state can do. It requires a working judiciary. It requires functioning prisons. It requires intelligence services capable of identifying, arresting, processing, and eliminating opponents in an organized way. It requires bureaucrats showing up to work and signing papers. A government that has genuinely lost control does not run efficient repression. It runs chaos. Prisons get overrun. Security forces defect. Orders stop being followed. So what the reporting actually describes is a state tightening its grip, not losing it. That's terrifying for Iranians. It's genuinely tragic. But it is the opposite of collapse. And when someone blends those two things together, images of executions plus images of airstrikes, and calls the mixture total defeat, they're relying on emotion to do work that evidence can't do. Now let's look at Iran's diplomatic position. Because a country that's been beaten doesn't set conditions, it accepts them. Back in June, Iran stated that a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon was a precondition for any wider negotiations. Think about that. Iran was making demands about a completely different theater as the entry price for talking. Iran also reiterated that certain topics are simply closed. Its ballistic missile program, specifically, was declared not open for negotiation, not negotiable under conditions, just off the table. President Pezeshkian had earlier laid out 3 specific conditions for ending the conflict entirely. Whether you find those conditions reasonable or outrageous is beside the point. The point is structural. Defeated parties do not publish red lines. Defeated parties do not declare entire weapons programs untouchable. Defeated parties do not require third-party ceasefires elsewhere before agreeing to sit down. Everything Iran has said publicly for 5 months has been the language of a government that still believes it has cards to play. You can argue it's bluffing. Maybe it is. But bluffing is itself a sign of retained agency. A country with nothing left doesn't get to bluff because nobody would sit at the table. Let's zoom out further. Because this war didn't appear from nowhere either. It grew out of an earlier, shorter conflict. According to the documented timeline, a ceasefire between Iran and Israel took effect in late June of last year, ending what became known as the 12-Day War. The United States and Qatar mediated it. That earlier ceasefire followed something remarkable. Iran had launched 14 missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, retaliating for American strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. The attack caused no casualties. And notably, Iran had given advance notification of the strike. Trump publicly thanked Iran for the warning and signaled openness to a ceasefire. That's not the behavior of a state trying to start a total war. That's the behavior of a state trying to save face while avoiding escalation, and an American administration willing to accept the off-ramp. Despite violations in its opening hours, that ceasefire held for 8 months. 8 months of relative quiet, until the strikes at the end of February shattered it. Why does that history matter so much? Because it proves something important. Ceasefires between these two sides do sometimes stabilize. They start ugly, with violations on both sides, and then either settle or explode. There's a rhythm here, and it's been observed before, which means this week's pause could realistically go either way. It might become the next 8-month quiet period, or it might become the 5th failed attempt in 5 months. Both outcomes have precedent. Anyone telling you with total certainty which one it is right now is guessing and dressing the guess up as analysis. Now let's talk about the cost, because scale matters when someone claims a war has been decided. The tracking notes, something quietly striking. The Pentagon's official Iran war death toll is no longer being updated the way it was. That's not a small administrative detail. A war intense enough to justify an actively maintained official casualty count for months. Now reaching a point where that count has become inconsistent tells you 2 things at once. It tells you the conflict has stretched long enough to exhaust the systems built to measure it. And it tells you the picture on the ground has become harder to see clearly, not easier. Beyond casualties, the disruption has been enormous. Flights in and out of the Middle East were halted for long stretches. Shipping was rerouted around both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Oil prices swung, freight costs climbed. Insurance markets recalculated risk for entire regions, and that ripple hit economies that have nothing to do with this war. Families in countries that never fired a shot paid more for fuel and food because of decisions made in Tehran and Washington. That's the real weight of this thing. And it's exactly why the truth matters more than the drama. Which brings us to the thread that has never been cut. The Strait of Hormuz. Look back at every single phase of this war and you'll find the same waterway sitting at the center of it. The April ceasefire strained over restricted access to the strait. The tense brinkmanship that followed was about the strait. The June memorandum collapsed because Iran struck vessels that bypassed its approved route through the strait. The renewed American strikes in July were aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping in and around that same corridor. And now, in this very pause, Iran says its only ongoing talks are with Oman about the strait. 5 months, 4 failed agreements, 1 unchanged core dispute. That is the single most revealing fact in this entire story. Because when a war ends in genuine defeat, the underlying dispute gets resolved as part of the ending. The winner dictates the outcome. The issue stops resurfacing. Here, the same issue keeps resurfacing as the trigger for every collapse and the subject of every new negotiation. That's not resolution. That's a loop. Iran still has the ability to threaten that waterway. As long as it does, it has leverage. And as long as it has leverage, nobody has been trapped into anything. Let me pause here for a different kind of ask. If this breakdown has already given you something the headlines didn't, the most useful thing you can do is share it. Send it to someone who forwarded you a panic post this week. That one share does more than 100 likes. And if you want the next one to go even deeper on the munitions supply question, type the word stockpiles in the comments so I know there's real appetite for it. Now let's define our terms honestly, because total defeat is a phrase people throw around without ever describing what it would look like. So what would it actually take? First, the government would have to collapse or formally surrender, not weaken, not struggle, cease to function as a governing authority or publicly accept terms of surrender. Second, Iran would have to lose the ability to project military force, both at home and across the region. No more strikes, no more proxies, no more capacity to threaten shipping. Third, there would have to be formal unconditional terms publicly acknowledged by Iran's own leadership. Not denied, not disputed, acknowledged. Fourth, retaliation would have to stop being an option at all. Now check the reporting against that list. Iran's government is functionally intact. By the opposition's own account, it's exercising more coercive authority at home, not less. Iran's military still retains the ability to strike shipping and regional targets, which is precisely why every ceasefire has broken. Iran's foreign ministry is actively publicly setting the terms of its own engagement, choosing the mediator and the topic. And Iran has denied the very existence of the agreement it's supposedly been forced into. 0 out of 4. That's not a close call. That's not mostly defeated. That's a conflict that hasn't reached anything resembling the threshold the headline is claiming. Now let me shift into interpretation, and I'll flag it clearly because you deserve to know where confirmed reporting ends and my reading begins. Here's my first read. The munitions detail is the most underweighted piece of information in this entire news cycle. It suggests American planners may view this pause as at least partly necessary rather than purely optional. That doesn't mean America is losing. It absolutely isn't. But it does mean the timing of de-escalation may be shaped by material limits as much as by strategy. The material limits are the least glamorous, most decisive force in warfare. Empires have been slowed by logistics far more often than by enemies. My second read, Iran's denial of the ceasefire is not confusion or chaos. It's clever. Think about what denial buys them. They get the practical benefit of the pause. Their air defenses recover. Their command structure reorganizes. Their people get a break from bombardment. And because they never admitted to any agreement, they can resume operations at any moment without technically violating anything. That's a free option. It's cynical and it's smart. It's also the exact opposite of desperation. Desperate governments sign things to make the bombing stop. Confident ones stay deliberately vague. My third read. The repression story and the war story need to be kept separate in your head. A regime executing prisoners at an unprecedented rate is a regime with functioning institutions of control. That is horrifying. It's also strategically meaningful, and the meaning is uncomfortable. It suggests the picture isn't Iran collapsing on all fronts. It's Iran hardening internally while absorbing external pressure. Honestly, that's a more troubling reality than the headline version, because a regime that is squeezed from outside and doubling down inside is a regime with fewer incentives to compromise, and more incentive to make its population pay the price for the pressure. My fourth read. Watch the durability of this specific pause, and set your expectations using the pattern rather than the hype. 4 attempts have failed in 5 months. A 5th pause now exists, and one side publicly denies it's an agreement at all. That is a weak foundation. Real ceasefires have named terms, defined timelines, and mutual acknowledgement. This one has a shrug from Tehran and a supply concern in Washington. That doesn't mean it will fail. It means the burden of proof is on the people claiming it won't. There's another layer running underneath all of this that rarely gets airtime. Sanctions. Just days before the war's opening strikes in late February, the United States Treasury imposed sanctions on more than 30 individuals, entities, and vessels tied to Iran's oil shipping network and related activity. That financial pressure has continued and expanded through every month of fighting since. So what you're actually looking at is a 3-track campaign. Kinetic strikes from the air, a naval blockade at sea, financial strangulation through sanctions. That's comprehensive. It's also revealing. Because if the goal had been accomplished, the pressure would be winding down, not expanding. The continued need to add new designations months into a war is itself evidence that the target hasn't been subdued. You don't keep tightening a vice on something that's already broken. Now let's do something most coverage never does. Let's read the language of the professionals rather than the language of the aggregators. Notice how careful the credible reporting is. This week's development was described as an attempt to give peace talk space. That's cautious, provisional wording. It describes a process, not a conclusion. Notice the tracking describing the two sides as pausing their attacks. Active verbs, both parties. A choice being made temporarily by people who could unmake it tomorrow. Nobody serious wrote that Iran had been defeated. Nobody serious wrote that the war was over. Nobody serious used the word total. That word appears only in the layer above reporting, the layer built for clicks. And once you learn to notice the gap between how journalists describe an event and how headlines summarize it, you'll never unsee it. Here's the mechanism, plainly stated. Take a real event, a pause in fighting. Strip out the messy details, who initiated it, why, under what conditions, with what denials attached. Then wrap the stripped-down fact in the most emotionally satisfying frame available. Trapped. Total. Defeat. The core is true. The frame is fiction. And because the core is true, the fiction feels credible. That's not journalism. That's packaging. And notice something else. This pattern clusters around pauses, specifically. It doesn't show up as heavily during active fighting. Why? Because active combat is easy to report accurately. A strike either happened or it didn't. A target was hit or it wasn't. The drama is already there. Nobody needs to embellish an explosion. A pause is different. A pause is ambiguous by nature. It demands interpretation. Why now? Who blinked? Who benefits? Will it hold? That uncertainty is empty space, and empty space always gets filled by whoever shouts loudest and fastest. So the total defeat claim didn't emerge during the heaviest bombardment. It emerged during a lull. The timing isn't a coincidence. It's the whole mechanism, visible in daylight. Let me put the honest summary in front of you, cleanly, with nothing dressed up. There is no credible reporting supporting the claim that Iran's leadership has been trapped into total defeat. What is confirmed is this. A pause in active strikes has held since around the 26th of July. Reports indicate diminished American munition stockpiles were a factor in the decision-making around it. Iran's foreign ministry has explicitly denied agreeing to any formal ceasefire, and states it has no direct talks with the United States, engaging only indirectly through Oman on the Strait of Hormuz. Oil markets reacted positively, but partially reversed within the same day. Iran has maintained consistent red lines throughout, including declaring its ballistic missile program non-negotiable, and Iranian domestic repression has intensified to what opposition sources describe as unprecedented levels, which reflects functioning coercive power, not the collapse of governing authority. Every one of those facts is significant. Not one of them is defeat. Before we close, I want to give you something more durable than this week's news, because next week there will be another headline just like it. We've now seen this exact structure repeat throughout this war. Troops supposedly trapped underground, a shadow fleet supposedly destroyed, a power grid supposedly erased, and now a regime finished. Every single time, the pattern is identical. A real event sits at the center. The framing wrapped around it overstates the finality and picks a direction the evidence doesn't support. And by the time anyone traces it back to the original sourcing, the claim has already traveled around the world twice. So carry this with you. When you see a claim of victory or collapse, ask 4 questions. Who is the original source, and what did they gain? What exact words did the reporting use? Before the headline rewrote them, does the losing side agree that it lost? And has the underlying dispute actually been resolved, or is it still sitting there, waiting to reignite? Apply those 4 questions to this week's story, and it falls apart in under a minute. None of this means Iran is winning. It isn't. This war has cost Tehran enormously. Its leadership was decapitated at the very start. Its economy is being strangled. Its people are being executed by their own government for asking for something better. Its nuclear and missile infrastructure has absorbed sustained damage. The pressure is genuine and it is heavy, but pressure is not defeat. Damage is not surrender. And a pause is not an ending. Wars do end. Sometimes they end decisively. One day, this one will end too, and it may end in a way that finally justifies dramatic language. But that day has not arrived, and pretending it has doesn't make anyone safer or smarter. It just makes the eventual reality harder to see. Here's the last thing I'll leave you with, and I want you to really sit with it. The most dangerous thing about a false victory story isn't that it's wrong. It's that it makes people stop watching. If you believe a war has been won, you look away. You stop asking questions. You stop counting the dead. You stop noticing the executions happening in the dark while the cameras point at the sky. And that's exactly when the worst things happen. So don't look away. Not yet. This pause is either the beginning of something durable or the 5th crack in a dam that's been failing for 5 months. Based on everything we've traced today, 4 broken agreements, an unresolved waterway, a denial from Tehran, and a supply problem in Washington, I don't think we'll be waiting long to find out which one it is. If you want to be here when the answer lands, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay skeptical. The truth in this war has never arrived loudly. It's always been sitting quietly, 4 paragraphs down, waiting for someone to read it. I'll see you in the next one.